remember about that morning on 9/11?
Well, you remember the different moments of that morning as the events were unfolding. So you don't really remember much about before you arrived at M.E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. So we were overnighting at the Colony Resort, all the press, the president, the staff, Secret Service, and I think the resort was actually closing down. That was the last day they were being open for the season, and short bus ride on the press. But so as principal deputy press secretary, I essentially filled in for the White House press secretary if he wasn't there. But oftentimes I would also be traveling, but I'd be embedded with the White House press corps. And so for that event, where the president was going to talk about education reform and the No Child Left Behind Act, part of his campaign to build public support for passing those reforms, we were overnighting there. Probably about 8 o'clock that morning, we got on the press buses to pre-position ahead of the president coming in the motorcade. And so we arrived at M.E. Booker Elementary School and got situated in the filing center. There's a filing center wherever we go for the press. I was in a large classroom there. It might have been like a science classroom, an art classroom or something. It was a pretty large size. So you have a TV set up in there where CNN was airing live, and you have all the different stations for all the reporters, and then a broadcast area where they can put together all their packages and so forth. At any rate, we got set up there. I moved into the library where the president was going to come and make remarks shortly after reading with the second grade classroom. That was the first part, and a photo op was going to be part of that, or was part of that presentation. So there we are sitting in the library waiting for the president to come and give remarks, and I'm sitting between two White House reporters, two seasoned White House reporters, David Sanger of the New York Times and Judy Keene of USA Today. And as I'm sitting there, this is pre-smartphones, pre the BlackBerries being used at the White House. So we had a flip phone and we had pagers. As I'm sitting there and we're just casually visiting, it was kind of another maybe routine kind of event that we were doing on education reform. I get a page, and I think it was almost to the minute that CNN was reporting what was happening in New York. And the page was from our press assistant back in the White House press office, who part of his responsibility was to track the breaking news. And it was very straightforward. It said CNN is reporting a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And I looked down at it, and I was like, huh. And David and Judy, the two White House reporters I was sitting between, said, what? And I said, it says CNN's reporting that a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And I think our initial reaction was, what a horrible accident. Well, we knew in the filing center there was a TV on, and it was live, and it was, so we got up, we walked over to the filing center across the hall, and I'm standing at the back of the room. All the press is at the tables, sitting there for their filing their stories and so forth. And we're all watching the World Trade Center on fire from the first plane hitting the Trade Center, one of the towers. And it wasn't but a short time later, all of a sudden some of us were talking, and there's a second explosion. And I remember some of the reporters in the room going, that was another plane, and some others, no, that was just another explosion from the first one, or the plane that had hit the World Trade Center. And then short time later, not very long at all, a replay shows a plane going into the second tower. And I'm getting chills as I speak to you right now. And all at that moment, every reporter in that room, I think, turned around and looked at me standing at the back of that classroom as if I had any more information at that point. They were just used to, engaging with me and getting information from me. At that same moment, the door opened to the classroom. I look over to my left, and it's one of our advanced team members. And he goes, "You need to get to the president's hold?" And I said, "Yes." So everything was happening pretty quickly. I followed the advanced person because he's taking me around, and we have to go outside the school. And to get into that classroom, to get to the president's hold, which was next to it, you had to go where the president was reading with the second grade class at the time. So he's leading me to that classroom, and as I'm going into that classroom, the press pool that was covering the president for the photo op is coming out the door. And I think it was Ann Compton of ABC who, immediately they see me as a spokesman for the White House and says something to the effect of, "Oh, we heard a second plane hit the other tower." And I said, "Well, yeah, I don't have any more information. I just saw that on TV just now." And so they're escorted out. And then I turn and I go to follow the advanced person to the president's holding room. Anywhere the president travels, there's always a president's holding room that has secure communications, TV in there. I think we actually had to get a TV in there, but had the secure communications and everything the president needs to relax or call back to the White House or talk with other members of the White House team or whoever in between events. So I'm walking across the back of that classroom, and I look at the president, not very far away at all, smaller classroom, and I'd never seen that look on his face before. And what I didn't realize at the moment was that Andy Card, the White House Chief of Staff, just a short time before that, had walked into that room during the event and whispered down in the president's ear, a second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack. But looking at that moment, I knew that the president, in his eyes, someone was reading. I don't think he was really paying close attention to it at the moment. His eyes were looking straight forward, that he knew we were at war. And our whole presidency was changing, not even 8 months into the presidency. So going to the president's hold with some other senior staffers that are in there and some of the traveling, the Secret Service and some others that are in that room. President comes walking in moments later, and the first thing we're doing is sitting around, he's sitting at a table, and we're talking about, well, he's got to go out and make some remarks and say something to the nation. In a situation like this, you can't communicate enough, and it was important for the nation to hear from the president. Throughout that day, they heard from the president, and that night, of course, with his primetime address. But at that moment, he's sitting there thinking about what he's going to say and getting advice from some of us around the table. My predecessor, Dan Bartlett, the communications director at the time, and I didn't really, in my position at the time, I didn't really weigh in much. But as we're talking, and he said something about this terrorist attack on the nation or something to that effect in his remarks, and Dan was kind of, should we say, do we know it's a terrorist attack? Should we say terrorist attack? And I said, well, just say apparent terrorist attack. I mean, it's pretty clear what had happened at that moment, and this was even before the Pentagon had been hit, or that Flight 93 had gone down in Pennsylvania. So he's working on his remarks. And then the one thing that I knew that I needed to do, because I was a liaison with the press for the White House, was to take some careful notes, because the president also spoke to 3 individuals during that time. And I think he was trying to also reach the mayor of New York at the time. But he did end up speaking to Governor Pataki and saying, just know this, we're going to mobilize all resources necessary to help you and support the people of New York at this time. He spoke to Director Mueller, the FBI director, who had been on the job all of about 10 days at that point in the administration. And he spoke to Vice President Cheney about what he was getting ready to do and say and go out there. And the TV was on in the back, and at one point we were watching, seeing the Twin Towers both in flames from the attacks. And then at some point the president said turn that off. He wanted to focus on what he was going to go and say. As we leave, so that's another moment during that morning, as we leave that room to go back to the library where the president's going to speak, and there's some curtains, blocking off an area where kind of staff can be behind the curtain before the president goes out to the podium, and some of the children and teachers and principal were there behind the president for the backdrop that was planned for that morning. My predecessor, Ari Flesher, turned to me, and we're just in the moment. He said, should you come with us on Air Force One? And we have a press charter, and that's what I was, typically at that time I'd be flying on the press charter with the press. And I just reflexively in the moment said, no, I think I need to stay here because I'm their only link to what's going on back in DC. And so it was a spur of the moment type decision. I later remember getting a lot of praise for staying behind for the press corps and being able to provide them information throughout that morning and even into the next day as we got stuck there because all the planes were grounded and so forth. Sometimes I tried to remind them, hey, remember when I stayed behind for you all? But at any rate, President gave his remarks. Then I immediately walked back through the classroom where the filing center was for the press, walked out to the playground where all the broadcast reporters were getting ready to go live on the air, and wanted to provide them color of who the president spoke to and what he had said in those conversations. And so I shared that information with them, and then immediately they were going on the air right after that, reporting, using some of that information in their reporting. Again, and then as I turned around, I'm walking back to the filing center from outside where the playground area is, and a producer for Fox News at the time, who I'd known through the campaign, comes running up to me. He says, Scott, we hear that the White House has been hit, the executive office building at the White House, which is part of the White House grounds and across from the West Wing. And that was probably the first moment that it really got even more personal for me, knowing staff back at the White House were there, knowing that my oldest brother was a member of the president's senior team and a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, worked in the executive office building. And this is the fog of war, right? So we walk it back into the filing center, and it was hard to kind of get information. I'm trying to get back in contact with a colleague who's sitting in the Situation Room at the White House, who we exchanged a lot of information throughout the day, but we had some trouble getting through on some of those lines at times. And we see on the TV that it was actually the Pentagon that had been hit. And you're thinking the most secure building probably in the world has now been hit by a plane. And it didn't lessen anything in terms of, knowing it wasn't the executive office building. What had happened was that a camera had been filming in that direction, and between where the camera was and the Pentagon was the executive office building. So the smoke was coming up, and initially they thought maybe the smoke was coming from the White House. And of course, we never know, to this day, we don't know for certain where exactly Flight 93 was headed before some heroes on that flight brought it down and saved a lot of people in the process. And so that's how the morning evolved there at Sarasota, Florida, from my vantage point. And everything changed about the White House that morning, from a White House that was focused on domestic policy and economic policy, probably more than anything else. All of a sudden, we are a wartime presidency.
How did some of those decisions get made? What was the internal discussion about grounding all flights and closing all these businesses, large businesses like Disney World and other potential targets?
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of discussions about that.
Well, and that day, I didn't, the president had left, but that day he made it clear, this is our priority, responding to what happened on 9/11, and that we are a wartime presidency now, and that everything puts this as the number one priority. And so we were working, you're already working 24/7 in the White House, and that's your life. But it was even more so after that point. There were so many different aspects going on to this. But on that day, and we learned later that Norm Mineta, who was the transportation secretary, in conversations with others, and vice president, and the president too, who was being rerouted away from D.C. because there was concern, inaccurate concerns about someone having the codenamed Air Force One and thinking that Air Force One maybe was a target. And the Secret Service was saying, no, no, no. And the president was saying, I want to get back to the White House. And the Secret Service kept saying, we can't let you go back to the White House. We have to act on what we know at this time, and it's not safe. And that was ongoing throughout that day until he got back later that evening and addressed the nation. But there were so many different conversations going on, from the Presidential Emergency Operations Center at the White House, where the Vice President was, Condi Rice was. Typically on any trip, the National Security Council, a National Security Advisor, or the Deputy National Security Advisor is traveling with the President. This day, neither of them were traveling with the president. It was the director of the Situation Room, Captain Lauer, who was traveling with the president and making sure that all the communications were there and so forth. So there's some unique aspects to that day that you just don't know what's going to happen any particular day at the White House, and certainly no one ever imagined that. And later in that morning, then seeing one tower come down and crumble to the ground, another one come crumbling down there. You talk about a moment when we were already in shock from the planes hitting the Twin Towers, and then the Pentagon, and then to see that happen, unimaginable. Just the shock and the horror you see of that happening in that moment. And still to this day, like many others, we all have different emotional reactions to it. Certainly those of us that were living it from the White House perspective react to it in a particularly personal way as well.
Yeah, it sounds like, as crazy as it was on the outside with misinformation and people saying I heard this or I heard that, it sounds like you were trying to sort through it all at the same time.
Absolutely. I was, so we're back at the school and still at the school while the president has left, and You even have some reporters later that day or by the next morning, they're breaking off into go to some of the, I guess there are a couple of flight schools there, or at least one in Florida, where those that had hijacked the planes and the Al-Qaeda terrorists had trained. And we later learned that they didn't really spend any time on landing a plane, which was a signal something's not quite right here. And I'm sitting there that morning after the president has left, back in conversation with a colleague of mine who's in the Situation Room, and she's even sitting there, and Richard Clark, counterterrorism head at that point on the National Security Council staff, is trying to get more information, but he's also saying, if they hit us, we're going down like a matchbox. And she's telling me that, and this is one of my closest colleagues at the White House, and I'm saying, you make sure to take care of yourself and be safe. And of course, the White House was evacuated, not too long later that morning. I think it was after the Pentagon was hit. I don't remember specifically, but just in kind of being there in Sarasota, Florida, and trying to get information, even that, and provide information to the reporters that were still there. It was, that was my focus that morning before we then ended up going back to where we were staying at the resort. And then the next morning, that was a whole nother story, trying to get the White House press corps back to the White House.
Because weren't they separated? I mean, didn't they have to take another flight or a different flight?
No, well, it's interesting. So that's another morning. And that night we're back at the resort because they kept it open for us one more day, and the whole White House press corps, except for the press pool, which was even scaled down to go on Air Force One that morning. Just a decision that was having to be made. We got to move fast. We got to get out of here. We got to scale this down. So a few of the usual size of the press pool was condensed even smaller, and we had a filing center at the resort we were staying at. One press assistant was there with me. So the next morning, I come into the filing center, and we have a kind of a area back in a back office in that filing center, just for it's kind of called the White House press office on the road, if you will, just a small area. But most of the reporters are there, and everybody's just getting situated. And one of the chief White House correspondents for an organization comes up to me, and I understand he was frustrated at the moment. Comes up to me in front of everybody as I walk in the room, said, "Scott, you're a deputy assistant to the president. You're the principal deputy White House press secretary. You got to get us back to the White House now and get us a plane." And I just kind of was taken aback the first thing when I walk into the room, and I said to the individual, I said, "I think there are more important things than you right now." And very to the point. A short time later, his producer came back into the press office, said, "You were right to stand him down there." I mean, the planes were all grounded, one, and those that were in service were either responding to what was happening in New York or military planes and responding in different ways. So because all the planes were grounded and the press charter was still there in Sarasota, Florida, I believe it was United Airlines, and they didn't want to have any liability of flying the White House press corps back to the White House, and they were concerned about putting a plane in the air, given the current situation, and not knowing, are there more attacks to come, for instance, or how might someone respond if they, mistake us for something we're not, and we're in the air. So we ended up working with the advance team there, just chartered the press buses to get the press back to the White House. And it was later that day, I don't remember exactly when we left. I just remember our advance guy there on the ground said, "Hey, got a Suburban, got a few people, why don't you get with us?" And I was kind of, at that point, I was, yeah, okay, let's get back as quick as we can. And I'm okay separating from the press corps at this point because all the news had shifted. And of course, that one reporter who confronted me when I first came in the room, I understood what was happening. Now the news had all shifted away from Sarasota. It was all back at the White House. And colleague of his is getting all the attention, covering the biggest news in our lifetime at the moment. And anyway, so, and then that, one of the moments I remember, we got in the Suburban. There's probably 6 or 7 of us. I don't remember exactly. We got the Secret Service press guy. So we probably and we all took turns driving. We probably had a heavy foot, trying to get back to DC as quick as we could. I think we actually got back in about 14 hours driving, which is pretty fast time. Press buses, I think, took about 16 hours, and we got back to Andrews Air Force Base, where some people's cars were and stuff, where we'd left from. And then I said, well, Harry, a press assistant, he has to come with us. We got to get him back. So anyway, we got in the Suburban. We're driving, and I remember it was pretty late at night, and I'd had a shift, and I think I was kind of in one of the back, probably the back right seat, and kind of had dozed off, but wasn't really sleeping, but trying to get a little bit of rest. And all of a sudden, this kind of big truck with kind of a crane on back comes driving by, and it's just a quiet moment. I just kind of look out the window, half awake, half asleep, and there's this huge American flag draped across the back of that crane on the back of that truck, and it's such a powerful moment, just a moment that I had sitting there looking at that and thinking about all that had happened in the last 24 plus hours, and to have that moment there.
And when you get back to DC, how have things changed?
Everything was focused on what had happened and how we're responding and what the next steps were. Of course, the night before, the president had gone out and addressed the nation and had, in his remarks, made a whole new declaration about our policy, the Bush Doctrine, that if you harbor a terrorist, we're going to treat you just the same as if you are a terrorist. That was a big decision made on that day that kind of drew the line in the sand, if you will, for what was to come, for better or worse. He was making clear that we have been attacked, and if you helped in any way, yeah.
And how did you feel the country was at the time? Because, I mean, it's easy to look at the comparison between now and then, but it definitely seemed like there was the rally around the flag principle.
Yeah.
That people were more unified about going to war.
Yeah.
Correct?
Absolutely. If you go back to that period in time, President Bush had approval ratings over 90%. The whole country was united, unlike we have seen since that time. And it's it was looking back on it, reflecting on it, it was a unique opportunity to bring the nation together, not just around what we needed to do to dismantle Al-Qaeda and go and get those responsible, but to try to do some big things for the nation. Now, a lot of things happened that then changed that, from the expansive war on terrorism that President Bush had, and going into Iraq, and that approval rating, did not hold, but it was an opportunity, and I think President Bush at the time, after the 9/11 attacks, certainly recognized how united the country was, and a lot of what we focused on was, how do you speak to the country and keep that spirit of unity that came after 9/11. It's 20 years later, it's just hard to think about where we are today in this country and how polarized we are, and where we were then and how united we were as a country, at least for those first few to several months after 9/11.
You've said so much. The other thing I would ask you is here we are 20 years later. We could talk for a whole hour about all the things that changed, especially in those few years immediately after 9/11, whether it be carrying fluids on a plane and just the way that we've operated. But it's a big kind of broad question. How do you think we've changed as a result of 9/11? Everything that you lived firsthand.
Well, it's hard for those of us that lived through 9/11, and I look back, and my eldest wasn't born until 2009. He doesn't know what that time was like, but how much things changed after 9/11, and you can't look back on that time and not think about all our men and women in uniform that were called into combat roles to go into the theater in Afghanistan and later into Iraq. And as I think back and reflect on 9/11, I can't help but thinking about all those who lost their lives that day, those in the buildings, those in the Pentagon, the first responders, the heroes, the firefighters, the police officers that without regard for their own safety were running there to help. when the towers came down. And you can't help but think about what it did in terms of changing your perspective in terms of the military. And I'm talking about the troops and the men and women in uniform that are called to do so much in their families. Not that I didn't have appreciation for them before, but you certainly gained a very, very deep appreciation for them after 9/11 and being in a wartime presidency when you're going side by side with the president to visit with the families of the fallen in private. No cameras around, no one seeing this. Not something we talked about at any length. They were private moments. Or the president is visiting wounded soldiers at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, wherever base he may be, where they are taking care of those who have just come back from the theater not long before and trying to rehabilitate, or walking into a room at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and the president is there to go room by room visiting with all those that have been wounded, present some with medals of honor. And you see one with, one of his legs has been completely amputated and does everything he can to stand up and salute the commander-in-chief as he walks into that room. You walk in another room where a sergeant is days out of the theater and bandages all over his top of his face, his eyes, because he had been had a traumatic brain injury from the wounds that he had suffered, and there sitting next to him is his wife, and actually from Texas, and 7-year-old kid, I believe. And he's sitting there, I think in a wheelchair, don't even know if he knows what's going on around him. And you watch the president go up there and whisper in his ear and ever so gently kiss him on the top of the forehead. And then look over at his 7-year-old son and says, "Your dad's a hero." It's pretty powerful stuff. That stuff sticks with you. And you never forget. And you never forget when you're sitting there serving in the White House about those troops with every decision that you make. Not me, but the president makes, with every decision the president makes, and that everything you're called to do.
I know your book was critical of kind of the mid-aughts and the decisions that were made by the White House in terms of
Iraq.
the dual wars, but it
Right.
sounds like just talking with you here, you still hold the president in high esteem for how he handled the events of that day and immediately after.
Yeah, one of the things when I wrote my memoir that I took time to reflect on after it had essentially been finished, and I looked at and considered who do I want to dedicate this to. And it came to me pretty quickly. It said, to those who serve. All those who serve. Anyone that serves and puts them in a place where they're serving others for whatever cause that may be, especially those in uniform, especially those first responders that put their lives at risk, but so many others. I mean, you sit there and you look at what's happening in Afghanistan these last few weeks, and a lot of emotions go through your head. I remember going to Afghanistan with the president, I think it was March 1, 2006, and going to Bagram Air Base. He spoke to the troops, separate and apart from the public side, being with the president when he's visiting with some of the special forces, Navy SEALs, who had looked at like they blended right in Afghanistan, had been living there, and are just sitting there saying, "We are ready whenever you need us. Just know that," to the president. Traveling to Kabul and sitting there in the presidential palace, meeting with Karzai and his cabinet, having lunch there, and now seeing the Taliban in the presidential palace, reclaiming the presidential palace, going to dedicate the U.S. Embassy that day, and all those that are serving in a diplomatic presence. And you're just sitting there thinking about the people of Afghanistan and the responsibility you feel like we have to continue to help and support the people of Afghanistan. Set aside the question of whether or not it's the right or wrong decision to pull our troops out of there and end this 20-year war. Certainly there's plenty of criticism to go around about the way it was done, and lives that were lost in that process, and lives that have been left behind to the whims of a regime that we know has a brutal past, and we don't know for certain, despite their words, that they've changed much, and particularly when you look at the leaders they've just now put in place. So a lot of different emotions just going through your head, and worry, probably more, I think twofold worry. One, you worry about the people of Afghanistan, particularly the women and children. Two, you worry from a safety standpoint about the spillover effect with Pakistan and how close they've been to the Taliban over the years, and the dangers that could come more from Pakistan maybe than Afghanistan.